If you would find Philippians, the first chapter, that's where we're looking today, and just kind of take care of a couple of things. Sunday school, and I hope you all stay for Sunday school, is starting a new section, and you're going to spend the next 6 or 7 weeks in the book of Philippians. If you've studied your lesson, you already know that, and that'll be good. You're getting a little double dose, and that's probably not a bad thing. Secondly, I wanted to suggest somebody in the Marshall family forgot to bring their checkbook today. And it was me. It was me. That was my responsibility. And so we're going to give online today for the first time at Immanuel Baptist Church. You bless us financially, and so once a month we give here. And so we're going to try and figure that out. And we think Karen can figure it out, but we're going to do that today. Tonight, we're going to look at the book of Ephesians, and if you saw that video at the beginning of the service about the new pastor and we're praying for you, that video is posted in all the places where the job position for Immanuel Baptist Church's senior pastor has been posted. So the idea is individuals maybe thinking about sending a resume will have seen that video. And they wanted you to see that. The search committee is going to be meeting this afternoon at 4:30, and we'll talk about where they're at and what's going on. And then tonight in the evening service, we're going to be looking at a passage in Ephesians 4, which is probably the great passage in the New Testament that talks about pastors and a little bit of what they should be doing and how that relates to the church. And we'll be looking at that passage tonight, and that's kind of an appropriate one to do that. But this morning, I hate to say this, we're going to talk about death. I mean, we got to talk about it. And understand, my experience as a pastor over the years is that people just don't really like to talk about death. I've done probably 500 funerals. I did 2 last week. Looks like I got 1 tomorrow and maybe 1 on Thursday. And I do a lot of funerals. Bottom line is people just really don't like to talk about death. I'm really good friends with a lot of funeral directors. Very few people just invite them over for dinner on a regular basis and have social acquaintances with funeral directors because it reminds them of death, and we're just not comfortable about that. I don't know if you're aware that there are classic responses in grief when you and I think about death. And when we have to think about the death of a loved one, the very first normal emotion is denial. We just don't even want to think about it. You hear that somebody died. Nope, can't believe that. Then the next one is shock. I mean, our bodies just sort of shut down because the idea of death is so uncomfortable for most of us. We don't like to talk about it. We don't like to think about it. Nobody just says, you know what, we don't have anything else to do. Let's just go over to the funeral home. Nobody does that. But today, we have to talk about death. And sometimes we're all forced to think about death. You get a phone call that somebody you know or you love has died. Or you come back from the doctor's office and you get a diagnosis that has that C word in it, cancer. Or you suddenly got to have a surgery and there's actually some risk involved. Sometimes we're just forced to think about death. And in the passage we're going to look at today, Paul is thinking about death. Now we know part of it's because he's in prison. He's waiting trial for Caesar every day. He has the potential that before the day is over, he might be tried and put to death. I mean, that's a reality. None of us are certain about any day, but he's certainly thinking about death. And what's so bizarre is when he talks about death, he doesn't talk about it as a negative thing. He talks about it as an amazing thing, as a good thing, a thing that literally is better than life. Now that's pretty bizarre, but that's what he wants us to think about, and the Scripture talks about that today. And so in Philippians, the first chapter, I think we'll back up to verse 20 to get the whole context. So he writes to them, "My eager expectation and hope is that I will not be ashamed about anything, but that now, as always, with all boldness, Christ will be highly honored in my body, whether by life or death. For me, living is Christ, and dying is gain. Now, if I live on in the flesh, that means fruitful work for me, and I don't know which one I should choose. I'm pressured by both. I have the desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary for you. Since I'm persuaded of this, I know that I will remain and continue with all of you for your advancement and joy in the faith, so that because of me, your confidence may grow in Christ Jesus when I come to see you again. Now, I know you all heard that passage and this idea that to be with Christ, to die, is the ultimate blessing, and living on maybe is even a challenge. But the truth is, most of us don't always think that way, and yet you and I know that that is the ultimate message of the gospel. I mean, that's really what the Bible is all about. The good news of the gospel begins with the bad news that all of us are sinners, and the wages of sin is death. And it's both physical death and spiritual death. Now, the physical death, as best we know, Adam and Eve would have lived forever in the Garden of Eden. Death was not in the garden at that moment until they disobeyed God. And when they sinned, when they disobeyed God and ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, in that moment, death, physical death, entered the world. Now, interesting thing is, if you look at the ages in the book of Genesis, they lived for a long time until eventually those years began to come, and death began eventually to come at 70 or 80 years. But literally, death was not in the world. But today, every one of us, because we are sinners by birth, every one of us are going to die. A physical death. It's going to happen. But there's also spiritual death. And by spiritual death, when they sinned, they were separated from God. They were cast out of the Garden of Eden. And in that moment, they were separated from God spiritually. And consequently, when you and I are born, we also begin life spiritually separated. That's spiritual death. And the reality is that if we live our lives in this world and nothing ever changes, then we will experience what the Bible calls the second death, which is eternal separation from God. And by the way, there's a difference between being separated from God in this world, because in this world, you and I still get to be around the sense of God's creation. I mean, we still have the evidence of God's work all around us. But if by so I understand hell, it is that nothing good that God has ever created and or His presence is absent from that place. That's spiritual death. And the bad news is that we are all destined for that spiritual death, but that's where the good news comes in, and that's what changes Jesus Christ's death on the cross and His resurrection. Next Sunday afternoon, I'm going to be the cross in Effingham. Have you ever driven by the cross? You can't hardly miss it if you go by there. 198 feet tall. Well, I was there and I spoke at the dedication this week 20 years ago. And so next Sunday afternoon, there's going to be a celebration, and I'm going to speak, and Greg Whaley will be here next Sunday night, and he'll be preaching. The truth of the matter is, as great a symbol as the cross, really a greater symbol would be an empty tomb. The only problem is I don't know how to build a 198-foot tall empty tomb. We discussed that. I don't know how you would do that. That would be a far greater symbol, because you understand that the cross literally means nothing without the resurrection. That the resurrection is what changes death. The resurrection is what makes Paul able to say these things. In fact, if you read on a little bit, we'll eventually get to chapter 3, where he says, what I really want to know is I want to know the power of the resurrection. The cross and the resurrection, that element of the good news, is what transforms death into eternal life. That makes all of the difference. That's the ultimate message of the good news, that in the resurrection there is power over sin. Jesus died on the cross because of sin, and when He rose again on the third day, sin is conquered, and death is conquered. And the reality is that transforms the nature of death and what death looks like and how you and I ought to even think about death. There's something phenomenal. In fact, I don't know necessarily. There's some speculation that when Paul was writing these words, Maybe it was about the same time that he wrote a letter to Timothy. And in that letter to Timothy, the second letter that he wrote, he said this, I am ready to be offered. The time of my departure is at hand. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my race. And there is henceforth for me a crown of righteousness laid up in heaven, and for all of those who love his appearing. I almost think that when he was thinking about death, he's talking about crossing the finish line. He's talking about getting on a ship and making the final journey. He was talking about going into the presence of God, and in this moment, with the prospect of death right in front of him, he says, that's an okay thing. You understand? That changes everything about the nature of death. The gospel changes life and death and allows us to look at it in an entirely different way. And that's why today, to be absolutely sure of salvation, of having come to know Jesus Christ, of having experienced the power of the cross and of the resurrection personally. The second part of my testimony I don't always share is that as I continued on living in a Christian family, going to church every Sunday, because I was the pastor's kid, you kind of had to go. There was no choice about that. Then I got down to college. And there was about a 2 or 3 year period, the last couple of years in high school, where I really didn't live for Jesus Christ. I did a few things that I'm not really proud of. But what really happened is in the midst of that time, I got away from Jesus Christ to the point that there became a loss of assurance of my salvation. In fact, in that farmhouse at Ewing, Illinois, on a Christmas over weekend, when I was a freshman in college, I just was so much under conviction. And the point of just not knowing for sure whether or not I was really a believer, whether I'd really trusted Christ or not. And literally, I got up in the middle of the night and got down on my knees beside the bed and I said, Jesus, if you're not in my heart, if I didn't get saved back then, I don't want to be uncertain about that. I want to know for sure that I have you in my life. If you're not in my heart already, come in right now. And immediately I had a sense of peace. Now, eventually, later on, I said, Lord, I don't really care. I just want to know that you're in my heart, but it'd be really nice if I knew, was it 7 or 18? Which one was it? And God made it as crystal clear for me, I think as a grace for me, that it was at 7 when I was saved. And 18, that was a matter of just being under conviction of having walked away from the Lord and being backslidden and getting right with Jesus. But I would tell you that for me in that moment, it was an issue of I don't want to be uncertain about death and life and heaven and hell. I want to be sure about that. And today, I want to tell you, Paul is obviously sure. And you and I need to be able to be sure. Now, because of that, I also want you to understand that this concept, this place that Paul is in, where he's thinking about life and death and saying, you know, death really looks pretty good. Now, that seems a little strange to some of us. But as a pastor, I have been blessed to know some wonderful folks who've known the Lord and loved the Lord, and as they got older in their life, actually got to this place in their life. Rosanna McNally lived to about 96, and I believe every time I visit her in the last 5 years, Pastor, why can't I just go be with Jesus? To be very honest, she was kind of ticked with God for a little while. I mean, you know, why does he make me live in this body? Why can't I just go be with Jesus? And I'd have to talk with her. And Beulah would say every time, I am in this sorry old body. Why can't Jesus just come and take me? And what good am I? And I've had that opportunity to visit with a lot of folks who, because the passing of years and the physical tiring of this world, as they began to think about being in the presence of God, that looked better and better and better. And there are people who get to that place. Now, while we're at that, because we're talking about death, let me just throw in a couple of extra things here. One is you do understand that because God is the author of life, He's the one who creates it and gives it, He's the one who really is supposed to be in charge of when it ends. Now, all sin is sin, but there is something really tragic about taking life and death out of God's hands and you and I doing something that would end the life that God has created. And that's why thou shalt not kill is such a big deal. That's why murder is such a serious kind of thing. All sin is sin, but that sin is about taking the creation of God. That's why abortion is such a tragic, terrible thing. It's why euthanasia is such a terrible thing. It's why suicide is such a tragic thing. It's the idea of you taking this amazing gift of life that God has given and taking it out of God's hands, so that's never appropriate. Which consequently means that we may indeed be in this world longer than we want to be in this world. That's just the way it really ought to be. By the way, while we're at that, let me just go ahead and say, I think it's probably okay to take death out of doctors' hands. That's a tough thing, but I think probably it's okay because all of our medical science, and we're grateful for every bit of it, sometimes prolongs life longer than it really needs to be. And I think there is a point of saying, okay, no more chemotherapy. No more radiation, no more drastic surgeries. I'm prepared to put life back in God's hands because I understand that death is not the worst thing in the world. In fact, might be the greatest blessing. But it still needs to be in God's hands. But there's another element in all of this that he says, I'm not really worried about death. And I today hope that every one of you could say, even if you're not prepared to say, I'm ready to go right now. But you could say, whenever it comes, I'm not worried because I know the cross and the resurrection are a part of my life, and I know where I'll spend eternity. Hope you have that assurance. But the other part is that if you are still in this world, the flip side is, he says, be ready for death, but live for Christ. Let me go ahead and take that because of that aging process. It may very well be that you find yourself in the place where life in this world is difficult. My dad talks about heaven a lot. He talks about missing my mom and being ready to go and be with him. But he also says, but as long as I live, I want to honor Christ. And I've heard a lot of those folks who've said, why can't I just go? Well, I can't do anything. I can't teach Sunday school. I can't even go to church. I can't do these things. And by the way, nobody wants to be a burden on anybody else. I understand that. But you realize that if God gives you a day, if he gives you a day of life, he expects you to do something with it. He expects you, and Paul gives us an amazing story right here. That he says, going to be with Jesus would be better, but if I live, I could be a blessing to somebody else. If I live, if God keeps me alive and he spares me, then his intention is, I'm going to do something to encourage somebody else's faith. And when I've had those conversations with Rose and Beulah and Clara and all the other ladies and men that I've had that conversation with is, as long as you're still here, decide to be a blessing. And yes, you can pray for every person in your family. You can pray for your church. You can continue to pray and you can be a blessing. And if you get to the place where you can't take care of yourself, and nobody wants to get there, I understand that, you can still, by an act of grace, determine not to be a pain in the neck to everybody who has to take care of you. Or another anatomical feature, whichever you want to think. It could be that way. And be honest, there's a point of saying, I don't know why it is, but you understand a lot of folks get to that place where they need other people to help them and other people to be a part of their life. And frankly, sometimes they just make everybody miserable around them. But you can say, Lord, if you give me a day, whatever that day looks like, I want to be a blessing. And maybe that blessing is that there are individuals who are going to take care of you, who are going to get the blessing. And you being gracious and being grateful and being as kind and as considerate of them as you possibly can ends up making a blessing of every single day. And Christ can still be honored even in those days that are the end of your days. While you're waiting for the next great miracle of life, eternal life, you still can choose to be a blessing. I think I've got a sermon about aging gracefully. It's not as fun as it used to be to preach. As I get older, it's not nearly as much fun, but there is something about whatever my days are, I want to be graceful in those days. And I want to continue to be a blessing to people any way that I can. Paul says, to die, that's great, but if I'm going to live, I want to be a blessing. I want to advance people's faith. I want to be an encourager. I want to make a positive difference. If I'm going to live, I want to live for Christ. My mom liked cemeteries. She liked epitaphs. She dragged us around all kinds of, especially Civil War cemeteries, old cemeteries, and one of my favorite epitaphs is, he lived till he died. Well, okay, duh. But do you not understand there is kind of a significant meaning there? That until I die, I'm going to live, but I really like the idea, he lived for Christ until he died. Now, over at the university, I got a math degree, and I did have a 400 level, senior level class in mathematical statistics. So let me just give you the bottom line is, looking at the crowd today, pretty good statistical chance none of you are going to die this week. I mean, pretty good chance none of you are going to die today. I mean, you probably are going to be okay. Most of you probably going to have some choices about tomorrow and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday. I mean, probably most of you are going to wake up tomorrow. I understand there's a chance you might not. And that's why you need to be absolutely sure about knowing Jesus Christ. But if you do wake up tomorrow, if you wake up and you look and just on the off chance you actually remember something from the sermon today, I never have any delusions about that. But if you do, all right, Lord, it's Monday. Probably may not have to go to work, Labor Day, I don't know, you might. But to be able to say, Lord, you've given me this day. I want to live it for you. And if that means I'm living it for you, it means probably that I'm going to try and be a blessing for some other people. You can begin right away by just starting to pray for all those other people. Pray for everybody in your family. Pray for your church. Pray for your new pastor. Pray for anything that God puts in your heart and mind, and bless those individuals as a part of living for Christ. And then as you go through your day, just go with the intention, Christ, I want you to be a part of this day, and I want to be a blessing to everyone I come across. People I talk to on the phone, the people I see if I eat out, the people I see at the grocery store, the people I see in my life, certainly the people in my family. And when Paul begins to think of the biggest things in life and death, when he's at this moment where he really doesn't know how much longer he's got to live, and he's thinking about life and death, when he thinks about death, he understands that if Jesus Christ is in the picture with a genuine story of conversion in your life, then death really would be gain. And tomorrow when I do a funeral for a believer, and it'll really be a pretty fun funeral, that I can say to them, today we're not really grieving for Ron because Ron is with Jesus, that when that moment of death comes, he's in the presence of God. He's found the healing, his heart that didn't work. And I'm going to tell him, I don't know whether glorified bodies get new hearts or not, whether they even need hearts. I don't know. But if you do, his body is in perfect shape, and he is starting the first day of eternity in the presence of God. So we're not grieving for him. Any grief is for us because we're going to miss him. And that's why we make absolutely sure that we know Jesus Christ, because we see those people again. Well, today, I want you to be sure about Jesus Christ. So that if death comes, whenever it comes, and whether it's tomorrow or probably not, maybe it's 50 years from now. Maybe it's suddenly and quickly with none of those difficult days. Or maybe it involves some days in the nursing home. Or maybe it involves some days where you're going to have to really struggle to be a blessing to other people. And it's going to be a challenge. But whenever it comes, you can say, death, because of Jesus Christ and the cross and the resurrection, is far better than anything in this world. And until then, if you wake up in the morning, or I even thought about this, if you fall asleep during the service and then you wake up, in that moment you can still say, I'm going to live for Christ because God has given me this moment and this day and for every day that He gives me. Until the next chapter begins, I want to live for Jesus Christ. So we're going to stand and we're going to sing. And I trust that you are ready. And if you're not, or if you're not sure, if you even struggle with doubts, there's ways to talk about that and ways to be certain about where you spend eternity, and just as many ways to be certain about how to live for Christ today. Let's stand and let's sing.